Welcome, everyone. My name is Felipe. I'm here with the Charter for Compassion. This is our first global read of the year 2025. Super excited to be hosting um, Ariel Burger, the author of the book Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom. And the facilitator is our friend Parker J. Palmer. We're super grateful to have you both once again here. It's an honor to be able to host you and to host this conversation about the book Witness. So with that, I will let you begin. And again, everybody, if you want to post questions, you're more than welcome to post them on the Q&A section or in the comments. And at the end of the webinar, we'll be making sure to answer those questions. If you're watching this webinar from our social media platforms on YouTube, on Facebook, or on LinkedIn, again, you can also post your questions in the comments there, and we'll be able to make sure to ask them at the end of the webinar. Parker, Ariel, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Felipe. And I'm just delighted to be here with good friends again and with those in the audience. Thanks for coming. We're going to spend the next hour exploring Ariel Burger's very important book about Elie Wiesel, as well as Ariel's related work in the field of moral education. I'll simply remind you, as you all know, that Elie Wiesel was a Romanian-born American writer, professor, and political activist who survived the horrors of the Holocaust at both Auschwitz and Buchenwald, and went on to win the 1986 Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of his many contributions to love, truth, and justice. Ariel Burger, Rabbi Dr. Ariel Burger, who has been a dear friend of mine for over a decade, met Professor Wiesel when Ariel was just 15 years old. From there, he went on to become Wiesel's friend, student, and teaching assistant at Boston University. A few years ago, Ariel, with the support of Elie Wiesel's widow and son, became the founding director of the Witness Institute, which works with young leaders all over the world to help keep Professor Wiesel's legacy alive. My friendship with Ariel, who is also a visual artist and a musician, has enriched my life with so many new understandings, insights, including the deep meaning of that word witness, obviously the key word in Ariel's book and in his leadership program, because it was a key word for Professor Wiesel. So, Ariel, my friend, let's start with that word witness. What do you want us to know? What would Professor Wiesel want us to know about what being a witness means? And what can help us embrace that critical role in the very challenging moral life of our own time?
Thanks, Parker. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and with the Charter for Compassion. For Professor Wiesel, the opposite of a witness is a spectator. And the primary move that we all have to make, not once in our lifetime, but as a constant practice, is moving from being spectators to being witnesses, which means people who look at the world and see human suffering, perhaps other forms of suffering, and see it at a distance, at a remove, and don't feel implicated. Those are spectators. And that's a kind of natural state for us as human beings. We protect ourselves with a certain kind of distancing from the world, but we are meant to be responsible and responsive and sensitive to the world around us. And that constant practice, that constant set of habits of moving from being a spectator to being a witness was really Professor Wiesel's preoccupation as a writer, as an activist, and especially as a teacher. And he loved teaching. And if you asked him, he would say, I'm a teacher first. It drives everything else that I do. My writing is a form of teaching. My activism is a form of teaching. And he was really obsessed with education for two reasons. One, he saw education as the primary ingredient for that movement from being a spectator to being a witness, that movement towards sensitization and responsibility. But he was also really preoccupied with a question based on his experience of the Holocaust. which is a question that other scholars have asked. How is it that so many of the leadership of the Nazi Party, the SS officers and others were highly educated people? Some of them had multiple PhDs. And so how could education fail so badly to sensitize people to the humanity of others? And what kind of education can actually do the job of sensitizing and building a sense of responsibility and creating witnesses? That was the project of Professor Wiesel's life as a teacher and as a writer and as an activist. And everything that he did emerged from that primary challenge. And for him, the secret ingredient within education that makes all the difference between the kind of education that can turn out a double PhD who murders people during the day and someone who is educated into humanity and into a humanized way of being, the real ingredient, the essential ingredient in that is what Professor Wiesel called memory. And if you ever heard him say the word memory, you heard it said with a capital M. It was a sacred word for him. And so from the time I met him at age 15 and later, especially when I was in his classroom at Boston University, where he taught for many years, I got to see him employ the secret of memory through education, through various pedagogic techniques, in order to sensitize and awaken students from around the world, people with very different backgrounds. And that's the legacy that I'm really most interested in here of my teacher, because I think we need that. We need that secret ingredient of memory, which is really about encountering stories with profound empathy, allowing stories to wound us. That's what he meant by memory. It's not only historical information, although that is important and that is, I think, very much under siege nowadays. There's a lot of counter-historical thinking going on and counterfactual thinking presented to us. But beyond that, there's the encounter with people's stories where we carry those stories and it changes our behavior. We can no longer look away from someone who's suffering because the story that I heard a week ago or a year ago or 10 years ago taps me on the shoulder and says, hey, remember that person who didn't look away. Remember the person who did look away and failed, and remember the terrible lessons of history. Remember what's possible when people take responsibility. Remember the person who suffered, whose story you now carry, whose story broke your heart open into sensitivity. And that really is the core of, I think, what Professor Wiesel's teaching was all about.
Yeah, this I want to work for a moment longer with this very important distinction between spectator and witness, participant, someone who's engaged in the event, in the action, in the history. It seems to me that in so many ways, at least in the US, we are deformed in both our educational and our religious institutions in the sense that we are conditioned to be spectators rather than witnesses. I think of all the hours I spent as a young person in classrooms, or in my case, at church, sitting there passively listening to experts tell me the score, as it were, with very few invitations to to join in the action, to become witness rather than spectator, to become participant rather than passive recipient. That's a huge amount of conditioning to overcome as adults if this is to be the path of a moral life. And I think it requires all kinds of fundamental rethinking about pedagogy in both educational and religious settings. What is it that allows a student to make that move? For example, it strikes me that if you don't invoke the student's story in relation to the story you're teaching, It's very unlikely that the student is going to become witness rather than spectator, because somehow at the heart of being a spectator is this story I'm learning about has nothing to do with me. It's about some world that somebody is telling me about, but it's not my world. It's not my experience. And I'm just wondering how, Professor Wiesel, how you think about issues at that level.
It's such a great set of contextual points and framing the question, and I think it's important to remember that Professor Wiesel grew up, and I grew up in a similar way in a very different time and place, in a in an environment in which in a Jewish learning environment in which we are encouraged to access the texts and to question them and to ask questions of our teachers. And the system isn't perfect. There are all kinds of issues in Jewish education and Jewish schools, but one of the things that I've heard reflected back to me from friends and colleagues from other faith traditions is that this is not something that appears in every tradition. And I remember growing up and being celebrated for challenging not only the teacher or the rabbi, but the text, the sacred text, because that's really our job, is to ask those questions. And Professor Wiesel grew up in a similar kind of environment, very different in that it was pre-Holocaust in Eastern Europe and different in other ways, but very similar in the continuity of that tradition of celebration of questions. When he came home, his mother would not say, "Did you answer well today in school?" She would say, "Did you ask a good question?"
Mm,
And that
mm,
was really the currency, the thing that was held up as the ideal, the value was to ask questions. Your questions matter. And when I teach, I really emphasize that whether we're doing an ancient text or a modern text or a text from any wisdom tradition, the questions that we ask and the both the resonances and the dissonances that we feel in reference to a text, a story, or an occurrence in the world are part of the story. They're part of the learning. They're part of the pedagogy. And Professor Wiesel translated that to a university context really profoundly. I mean, he was teaching literature, but it was really an interdisciplinary exploration of literature, history, and current events, and some theology thrown in. And the the most important voice in the room, really, from his perspective, was the voice of the students who were asking questions. And at the beginning of every semester, he would give a little talk about that. He would say, with great sincerity, "I'm the best student in the class. My job is to listen to your questions, and I will learn as much from you as you will learn from me." And he really meant it. And so when a student asked a question, even if it was a question that I knew that he had heard 1,000 times before, he took it very seriously. If he heard a question that seemed fuzzy or weak, he would dig and engage in dialogue to reveal the question behind the question. And there was always a better question hiding there because he really celebrated those questions. So I think that came from his upbringing, but it was also a choice to celebrate the subjectivity of the learner and to say we are not meant to be robots, imbibing information and spitting it back out. We are meant to be wrestling with ideas and wrestling with history and wrestling with literature and our own role in the world.
yeah, yeah. That's a huge transformation of the question as a tool of inquiry and of as Rilke would say, living the question as a way of living more deeply into the moral life or whatever life it is we're wanting to live. Um, from a framing that says no, questions are just a checklist of whether you're getting it right or wrong, right? Because normally that's how we think of questions in education. You either have the right answer or you have the wrong answer, but these are not sort of milestones on a never-ending highway of exploration into the depths of an issue. And that reminds me, Ariel, before we leave memory, which is, I think, but one of the key dimensions or ingredients of becoming a witness, I was reminded of something you said once that really struck me about how the cultivation of memory in the sense that Professor Wiesel urged us to do it involves an honest moral inventory of our own responses, our own actions, which have as much to do with what we got wrong as what we got right, right? I'd love to hear you say more about that because for me, that was I think, a real wake-up call. And I want to underscore as we go here that the subtitle of your book, Witness, is really important. Uh, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom. It, I find it an extraordinarily valuable book because it's not only about what Professor Wiesel taught, it's about how he taught it. And it gives me, the reader, a chance to get more fully into the frame of a good student of the substance of his teachings.
Thanks, Parker. That was really the goal in writing the book, and it felt like a very difficult goal to accomplish because the experience of being in the classroom was so intense and rarefied and inspiring and complex. But I tried to share my experience as someone sitting in that classroom and allow the reader to inhabit that seat. Um, the moral inventory is so important because I think, even the word moral has all kinds of associations, certainly in American culture. And I often tell our students um, that the opposite of moral in our way of thinking is not immoral. The opposite of moral is moralizing.
Oh,
And it's very easy when we invoke morality to begin with a set of dogmas or postulates that we are trying to advance and persuade people to adopt. But I think the work of moral education is much more humble and curious than that. And the reason I think that is that if we look at the world and we see some of the worst perpetrators of atrocities, they often invoked moral principles to justify their behavior, right? We're purifying the nation. We're getting rid of these foreigners who pose a moral or existential threat. Um, and we know where those roads lead, and we know that moral language can be dangerous. And so we really want to start with humility in a sense that if the world looks the way it looks, if the world is as crazy as it is, and if a million children are going hungry every night when we have enough food to feed everyone 2.5 times over, and there are still wars in the world, and there's still homelessness, and we're not addressing what we know to be a profound and immediate climate crisis, and there's radical polarization and othering and dehumanization happening in our neighborhoods and places across the world, then obviously something's wrong. Even though we talk about morality and we talk about values and we supposedly teach our children values all the time in every culture, we're obviously getting something wrong. And so I think a good starting point, a firm starting point, is to say, well, let's assume we're getting things wrong. And let's start with that really humble awareness that I need to explore my mistakes and my failings. And I need to be really honest about that and develop um, the courage and the strength and the communal support to do that kind of inventory. And once I do that and I start to learn my own strengths and weaknesses, and especially my weaknesses, and we do that collectively, we can start to address those weaknesses without making all kinds of assumptions and using highfalutin language about morality and values that don't really serve us and that really just serve as cliches and platitudes that sort of are performative, or They make us feel like we're off the hook. We've sort of checked the box instead of doing the really hard work. So my assumption in all the work that we do in moral education is that we're getting it wrong all the time. We're failing better and better. We're trying to learn from our mistakes and be really honest about our mistakes so that we can improve gradually, incrementally together with great honesty and great humility. And I think that's where growth can happen. I think that's where I've seen in my own life some improvement in some areas, in interpersonal ways, or in the way that I relate when I'm walking down the street to someone who's hungry or is suffering. I've seen that movement towards being a witness. And by the way, witness, is the title of my book. And I only realized after, it's a bit embarrassing, but I only realized a year or so after the book came out that it can serve as a verb and a call to action. Please witness.
Yeah.
And that was unintentional, but I think the word functions well as a call to a constant struggle to become more sensitive and more responsible, and to take our failures seriously and instructive as instructive points of information rather than paralyzing sources of shame.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we move on to the next rubric under which you discuss what it means to witness, which I'm eager to get to, I just want to note an experiential resonance that I had when you were talking about moralism, especially. For me, the moments of significant moral growth in my life have happened, or at least have been initiated, when I'm sitting with a group of people where there is a fair amount of relational trust, and we can be honest with each other about the places where we've screwed up, messed up, fallen down, fallen short of our own aspirations when it comes to public and private morality. And the one thing that will squelch all of that faster than anything else is moralism, the kind of moralism that says, if you haven't lived up to this standard, shame on you. You should slink away in shame from the good people who live the good life. So I think there's a wide range of religious leaders and teachers who could afford to listen to that admonition
Mm.
and learn perhaps how to create um, those judgment-free zones where paradoxically we can have the kind of conversation that actually helps us realize we've fallen short, why we've fallen short, and how we might move closer to our own aspirational lives.
Mm.
Moralism is pretty deadly stuff. I've discovered time and again.
Yeah, yeah. And I just want to say Professor Wiesel held a space like that in a very profound way, because it was filled with a kind of clarity about his values and his sense of history and the dangers of history, the things to watch out for. But in the classroom, at least, there was a real sense of openness and acceptance that allowed students, particularly younger students, to explore and feel their way into moral questions with permission to get it wrong and to share their own mistakes. And he sometimes did the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes shared his struggles and mistakes, and it was profoundly moving to hear that from someone who was so accomplished. And it gave us permission to do the same thing. It's really essential.
Well, the next rubric under which I know you think about witness and witnessing is one called otherness, which is another chapter in your book, as is memory. Um, I'd love to take time right now to explore otherness a bit, and then remind our audience that we would welcome questions being posed in the chat, which Felipe will gather up and ask us later. Um, and we will carry on with our own questions um, as need be. But let's talk about otherness, which is this point in life where I don't know, we so often fall short of our aspirational lives, I think, out of fear of that which is different, that which we don't understand, that which kind of quietly challenges some of our taken for granted assumptions about ourselves and our lives.
Well, we're by nature, I think, pretty invested in our sense of self and our sense of orientation and position and even ideology and loyalty to various camps. And we can easily feel threatened by someone who sees things really differently. But when we think about the honesty of a moral inventory we were just talking about, how is it at all possible for me to recognize my assumptions, the invisible assumptions that drive me, when it's almost like I've been wearing these glasses forever and I'm not even aware that I'm wearing them anymore. I just look through the lenses and they either distort reality or shift reality in some way. Maybe they're dirty or have scratches on them. It's very hard to become aware of the lens through which we look at things, which are the assumptions that really drive us. The best way I know to do that, and this is just from my own experience, I've had the experience over and over again of suddenly becoming aware of that a belief I had about the world that was invisible to me, an assumption that I took for granted, was not the only way of seeing the world, that it was an assumption, and that it could be challenged or questioned. And that invariably happened in the encounter with someone else who saw things differently. And so over time, I started to feel really excited about those moments when I would encounter someone with a really different position on an issue, because I saw the opportunity to cast light on my own invisible assumptions. And so, aside from the value of pluralism and inclusion, which I believe in very, very deeply, aside from the value of kindness and making room for multiple positions as its own value, otherness and encountering otherness has tremendous value for us if we're interested in any sort of quest for truth with humility, with honesty. And, that's where the opportunity is, precisely where we disagree. And so one of the places that I think about a lot, one of the places I do a lot of work, and we do a lot of work with our fellows, our students in our Witness Institute work, is noticing those places where we get really tight or threatened when we encounter a different position. And we all have those places where we get triggered, we get scared, we get angry in encountering another position. And where are those places where we are actually in the presence of a position that is harmful and deliberately harmful? And maybe there are places where we need to challenge and fight a position that is actually dehumanizing. And where are we in the presence of something that's not that willing dehumanization or violence promoting position, but just a different position that threatens me? And where can I soften and lean into it? And that's where we serve as mirrors for each other. That's where we make each other smarter. That's where getting people together across political and ideological differences with the right kind of context and structure and good practices can help us to learn and really deepen ourselves.
Yeah, it has a lot to do, again, doesn't it? And it's important to note, I think, in the context of your book and of Professor Wiesel's commitment to being a teacher first and foremost, that you're really talking about creating the pedagogical conditions that allow us to open up to
Yeah.
otherness that may challenge us. I had the thought the other day uh, that how grotesque it would be for me to be sitting here in this 85-year-old body uh, with the same ideas that I had when I was 15. Uh, and the reason that struck me as an edifying thought is that I would be exactly that sitting here with the same ideas I had at 15, had it not been for a very long series of encounters with otherness, whether that was racial or gender related or religious or philosophical or political. It's in those encounters with otherness that I began to evolve myself, um, in response to what at first seemed very threatening, but turned out to be, evocative of more and more of who I really was, and what I had the potential to grow into. And as the old saying goes, God ain't finished with me yet. I mean, that's an ongoing process, right, in life, as long as you're alive to life. I think for me, a really big question these days is, why do so many people stick with what they knew at 15, as if that's all they wanted or all the world had to offer? What is that deeper source of the fear of otherness that keeps, it seems to me, so many people from taking that next step in kind of opening up to the world and to their own potentials?
And why do we keep rewarding that kind of behavior, that kind of self-definition along party lines, that kind of rigid persistence of an ideological state?
Mm-hmm.
I don't reward the discomfort of movement, of growth, of self-inquiry and self-interrogation. And there are places where that does happen. And how do we learn from those places? And that's really, I mean, Professor Wiesel's classroom was for me the model for that, where people came together from across many differences. You know, we had children of and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors in the class, and occasionally grandchildren of Nazi officers in the class as well, and people who had gone through um, really intense experiences in war zones and conflict zones around the world. And I became really interested in the question you just raised about the pedagogic conditions for this work. What, or in using a metaphor from Jewish mysticism, how do we build the vessels to contain that intensity of light that happens when you have really different perspectives? And how do we see it as an opportunity, not a threat? And when I encounter someone who disagrees with me, how do I engage in disagreement for the sake of the relationship, for the sake of greater closeness, for the sake of learning, not for the sake of triumph and smashing down their position? And I know that sounds somewhat naive in a moment where our politics are defined by a kind of gladiatorial vibe. But I think it's possible to create small circles of people doing this work and modeling it and sharing it, and then thinking about how do we bring that into our educational and other institutions. And I've seen it work really powerfully in many different contexts when people are fundamentally willing to engage in that kind of work. And as I said before, there are limits, and Professor Wiesel had his limits. He would famously not engage in debate with Holocaust deniers. He didn't want to dignify them with a conversation, right? So there are limits, and we have to think about where the limits are. Who is beyond the pale because their position is actively harmful, willingly harmful, um, self-consciously harmful. Um, but there's a vast field within those bounds that I think we often turn away from, and we just run away from or try to destroy. And we end up less intelligent as a result, and certainly less kind as a result.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So again, we're back to pedagogy, which interestingly to me is not a great mystery. It has a lot to do, I think, with establishing hospitality, um, to not only the stranger but to strange ideas, and doing so, partly out of enlightened self-interest. The, the goal of personal growth seems to me to be something that everyone, once you strip away all that distorts who we are and what we really want, that everyone aspires to 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 grow larger minds and larger hearts. It's very, very painful to see political leaders who actually move in the opposite direction in order to divide and conquer, in order to secure a base or a stranglehold on a certain portion of the population. But I'm with you when you say, I think it's always possible to establish small groups of people dotting the landscape, who can dance to a different tune, who can march to a different drum, and create those sort of pockets of possibility in our midst where people look in and say, wow, that looks like life-giving stuff. I'd like some of that too. And obviously that's what Professor Wiesel knew how to do, in the classroom. I
And
think
Parker, sorry, I just want to add a footnote to what you just said, which is that he did it in the classroom. He also did it on the international stage, and he would come back to the classroom and share stories about that. And so that interface of recognizing that, he brought Nelson Mandela and a member of the de Klerk government, the apartheid government, together at a conference offline in a way that allowed for human connection and dialogue that had never happened before, that had something to do with the eventual dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. It played a small but significant role, that personal contact. And there were many stories like that of Professor Wiesel creating those conditions, not in the classroom, but in those much more historically significant, perhaps, spaces. And the lesson for us in the classroom was that we're all human. The same dynamics apply, whether we're talking about this moment in this classroom or these intractable conflicts in the world. We have to get at the root of human behavior if we're going to change the trajectory. The same rules apply. The same rules of otherness apply in dialogue and discomfort. And a human being getting more comfortable with discomfort is going to make all the difference, whether it's in the classroom or in the international stage.
right. I love the mass larger scale example that you gave, because I do believe it. I've seen it with my own eyes that some people carry this safe space within themselves. It's a feature of their personality or their way of being in the world. And whether they're with 30 people or 3,000 people, that safe space is felt and something new happens. I want to bring Felipe back, into the conversation for a moment, because there's a question, Felipe, in the chat that maybe you could read for us.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Thank
absolutely. So
thank
the
you.
question is from Gardner, and it says, I also enjoyed being taught by Elie Wiesel as an undergraduate. 50 years later, my question is, how did he approach the intersection of spirituality and morality? He lost his faith that night. Speak to how he regained it. The circles of trust that Parker has promoted strikes me as the incubator of such an intersection. At the charter, the circle of trust that has become the crown jewel of shifting out attitudes that allow a more heart-centered life, of bringing morality and spirituality together. Thank you for this amazing conversation. Without trust, it is very difficult to witness from memory. Thank you. Trust is imploding across the globe. Thank you, Ariel. Your book is a blessing. Parker, your gift has been beyond measure. Compassion in Las Vegas has been implementing circles of the last 15 years. So thank you for that. So I guess back to the question. How did he approach intersection of spirituality and morality?
Thank you for
Thank
the question and the comments. Parker, there's a lot there for you too with circles of trust that I'd love for you to respond to. Do you want to go first?
No, I'd like you to go first, my friend. I'm
Um,
always better off when I follow in your wake and learn from what you have to say.
okay, so the question of spirituality and morality, and the question of faith and doubt was obviously very central for Professor Wiesel. If any of you read Night, I'm sure many of you have, you know that as the questioner referenced, his faith was shattered during the Holocaust. He tells several stories in Night about the key moments in that process. It's important to know that his childhood faith was a very wholehearted, sincere, and simple faith, a pre-war, pre-modern kind of faith, a mystical faith. And it was shattered against the brick wall of the experience of the Holocaust. And so when he writes in Night, never again shall I forget that night that shattered my faith forever. And when he ends the book with an image of himself looking in the mirror and a corpse is looking back, we get the impression that his faith is gone forever. But over time, he reconstituted a sense of faith that he called a wounded faith, which is a faith that coexists with questions and with wrestling and with real struggling with tradition, with God, with humanity. And so faith was a really critical element for Professor Wiesel. And I don't just mean faith in God, although that was, of course, a central ongoing wrestling match and conversation for him, but also faith in humanity. He saw the world's silence. He heard the world's deafening silence in response to what was happening. And after the war, he learned that the world really knew what was happening, that the Holocaust was reported in the pages of the New York Times, and people knew, and the Allies refused to bomb the tracks to Auschwitz, which would have slowed down the Nazi machinery of death. And this really challenged his faith in humanity. And yet he chose to teach students and invest in the next generation, generations, really plural. He chose to have a family after wrestling with that question, how can I bring children into this world? And he really chose to work on behalf of humanity. And so this sort of alchemical process of transforming his suffering into profound motivation for faithful work on behalf of humanity it's a mystery. It's a testament to who he was, the roots of his childhood and his background, and the strength that he drew from his parents and grandparents. But he also showed us a model for living in a way that transcends the false binary between faith and doubt, or faith and questions. And I remember when I was 19 years old, I sat with him in a hotel lobby in Jerusalem, and I asked him, is it possible to build a life of faith, or a religious life, a spiritual life, entirely based on questions and doubts? Because at that point, I only had questions and doubts. I didn't have any affirmative or firm beliefs. I was really in a place of a lot of doubt and a lot of questioning. And he said, if you bring faith and doubt together, it's good. And it actually can save you from the dangers of faith, which can lead to fanaticism and extremism. If you remember to question, if you remember to hesitate, then you can live a healthy life of faith. That was very important for me to hear, especially where I was spending time in deeply religious communities. And I think it's a message we need to remind ourselves today, that true faith can handle questions. It's only the false icons and idols that are threatened by our questions. And so if you ask a question and a rabbi or a priest or minister or imam shuts down the question, that's a sign of insecurity of the faith of the tradition. And for Professor Wiesel, there was no question that was off limits. All the questions were welcome. And I think that was something that really shaped not only his spiritual life and his relationship to humanity, but his activism and his morality as well, because a morality that becomes fanatical is as dangerous as a religious tradition that becomes fanatical. And you can have secular fanatics and political fanatics who are equally humorless and equally threatened by any questions or any questioning. So the embrace of questions and the integration of questions with faith and conviction in general, not just in spiritual terms, I think is something we have to really continue to develop as a species. How do we have strong conviction and remain really open and soft and welcoming of all the questions that come up from ourselves and from others?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ariel, for such a rich and deep answer. I want to thank also Gard Jameson for his question and his kind comments, and acknowledge that we at my little organization, the Center for Courage and Renewal, have a wonderful partnership with the Charter for Compassion around creating these circles of trust, these safe spaces, these little pockets of possibility, which we've been touching on from time to time in this conversation. And I just want to underscore what for me, Ariel, was a very important part of your response to Gard Jameson's question. And that is this axiom that has been so helpful to me over the years, that violence is what happens when we don't know what else to do with our suffering. Um, Suffering so often in this world leads to violence because we haven't helped people understand the creative outcome that is represented by something like the wounded healer or the wounded faith. The fact that we can incorporate that which wounds us into an outreaching service to the rest of the world that's not in spite of our wound, but because of our wound. The wound helps us understand more deeply. The wound helps us open a compassionate space in our hearts and minds. The wound can actually animate action because the action is being performed not only for those who will benefit from it, but for the therapeutic effect it has on the person taking the action. I mean, one of the most basic questions with a wound is, what do I do with this? How do I keep it from dragging me down and down and down until I'm barely living anymore? And I think your answer for me touches on the redemptive possibilities of turning a wound into something of a gift that is healing for others. Felipe, did you have a word for us?
I do have one more question that popped up on Facebook. So this says, what reaction do you think Mr. Wiesel would have had to what happened in Gaza, the current state of Israel, and now how the Trump presidency is unfolding? Any advice on how to face all these things as a regular human being?
So much to say. It's an important question. I think the first thing to know is that Professor Wiesel was a very strong believer in peace in the Middle East, in a two-state solution, and in the possibility of peace and dialogue. In addition to connecting Nelson Mandela and a member of the de Klerk government, he also was the first to introduce offline in a very safe space, as Parker was saying, Mahmoud Abbas and Ehud Olmert, the then Israeli prime minister and Palestinian Authority president, without any journalists, without any scrutiny, without any publicity, at a conference, at a gathering dedicated to exploring the role of hatred in the world. And they began a conversation in the 90s that also was critically important and had a role to play in the unfolding of the eventual Oslo Accords and afterwards. Professor Wiesel was also, from the 70s on, a Zionist. He believed very deeply in the liberation movement of the Jewish people and the nonviolent liberation movement and return of the Jewish people to their ancestral home. And those things nowadays seem like they're impossibly in tension, but for him and for many people of his generation, they were not at all in tension. It's possible to believe in that liberation movement and reach out profoundly and consistently in peace and for the sake of peace to Palestinians. And so I think he would have seen what's happening now as a tragedy, but he wouldn't have mentioned Gaza, I think, without mentioning the attack of Hamas on October 7th and the hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. And so I think he would be doing something that we're not seeing enough of now, which is recognizing the humanity of all the innocents involved. There's so much simplistic taking of sides and so much disinformation that it's very hard to do the difficult work of moral thinking around this issue. Instead, we get moralizing, we get ideological extremism in various forms on our college campuses and elsewhere, when what we really need, and this is what my friends who are Israeli and Palestinian peacemakers will say over and over again, what we need in order to have a prospect of true peace, lasting, sustainable peace between these two peoples who both have needs and claims and rights that are significant and real and human, what we need is complex moral thinking and humanizing and relationship building. And so I'll just share briefly that in our Witness Institute Fellowship this year, we have an Israeli and a Palestinian in our group. And they didn't know each other when we started. They're both really dedicated to peacemaking efforts in different ways. And there are a lot of people and a lot of organizations dedicated to peacemaking. Even now, they're struggling a lot. They need support and they need encouragement. But there are a lot of people who have not given up on peace and the prospect of real peace, not the kind of top-down political process that has failed in the Middle East, but the bottom-up relational kind of work that can really lead somewhere where people recognize their shared interests and shared simple values like raising our children in peace, which necessitates the challenging of all kinds of political and religious extremism. And so seeing these two people in our small circle become close and begin to dream together about what they can do in very practical ways on the ground to continue to build not only their own relationship, but to build relationships between Israelis and Palestinians in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, where they live, is profoundly hopeful. And I think Professor Wiesel, to the end of his life, believed that there would be peace in that region, as far away as it seems right now.
I want to say, Ariel, that I have so much respect for you in pushing back on the disinformation that comes out of that region in two ways. One is through your work with the Witness Fellows, who, as you've said, are located in different places in the world, including in the Middle East. And the other is the fact that you visit the Middle East with some regularity and try to stay in touch there with people who are performing this bridging function. And it comes to me that Witness, when you talked about your two fellows in the program who are building that bridge in their own relationship, Witness not only means refusing to blink the evil that is done and having a capacity to witness to it as time goes on. It also means seeing what's possible among human beings and not disbelieving it. Seeing that it is possible for two people who would appear to be at opposite ends of a conflict to come together in meaningful ways and explore paths to peace. And to embrace the fact that if two people can do that, two more people can do that, and two more, and two more, and two more. I'm convinced that some of the biggest transformations in my life have come from seeing these what would seem to be small moments of hope and possibility, and yet realizing that they prove that humanity is capable of going in this direction and refusing ever again to disbelieve in that possibility. So thank you for lifting that up for all of us. You know, hard to believe, but we're about at the point where I think Felipe has some things to say about next steps in the work of the Charter for Compassion. So let me say, as we close out our part, Ariel, what a joy as always it's been to be with you today and with your book and with your understandings from Professor Wiesel, and say thank you so much to the Charter for Compassion for hosting this and a lot of other conversations that I think show a lot of us what's possible.
Thank you, Parker. Thanks so much for doing this with me today. And thank you, Felipe and the Charter for Compassion, all of you for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you both for this incredible conversation. And one last time for me to not butcher this name, Professor Wiesel. I said it like wrong every time. Anyways, really appreciate your conversation and the wisdom that was shared to all of us, not only here on this webinar, but also the people that will be watching this recording on our YouTube channel. And we will be sending the link to everyone that registered for this, and you can always access it there. I wanted to take the last couple of minutes just to let you know about the different things that are happening with the Charter for Compassion. We have two global reads in February. The first one is God and Nuclear Weapons. This is going to happen on Wednesday, February 26th at 9 a.m. Pacific. The author is Reverend William E. Swing. He's the founder of United Religions Initiative, a huge interfaith organization that we work with very closely. And the facilitator is going to be our executive director, Marilyn Turkovich. Do not miss this one. And then 2 days later, February, Friday, it says November 20th, but it's February 28th. The book is Being Noble with author Livia Malcaño. She's an Italian journalist. We actually got to meet her at the Nobel Laureate Summit this past September, October in Mexico. So she's going to be our guest 2 days later for that. We also want to remind everyone that World Interfaith Harmony Week is beginning February 1st until the 7th. Charter for Compassion, Interfaith and Spirituality sector of the organization is putting a 14-day program of different meditations and practices of different faith traditions and spiritual practices and indigenous traditions. So that's something to check out. And then we have Community Collaboration Ambassadors. This is a special program on how to become a community ambassador in your city, town, or village. This is also happening on Friday, February 28th at 11 Pacific. And we have our Harmony of Humanity webinar series that is with our executive director, Marilyn Turkovich. Every Wednesday at 8 a.m., she takes us on a music journey. And through this 8 weeks from the beginning of the year until the end of February is focused on Black music and Black history music, honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with our 40 Days of Peace campaign. And last but not least, we have our Sangha as our own circle of trust that we put every last Saturday of the month for the Charter for Compassion at 9 a.m. Pacific time. My friends, thank you so much once again for joining us. Thank you everyone that attended, and for everybody that is watching this recording. You can always send us a message at contact@charterforcompassion.org, and we will be seeing you on our next global read at the end of next month. Thanks again.